Following the death of Kyiv's Grand Prince Yaroslav in 1054, there was a succession of coups and hostile takeovers. Then, in 1169, a powerful prince from the Rusland to the east, in what is now Russia, by the name of Andrei Bogolyubsky, seized Kyiv. His sacking of the city left deep scars in the memories of the local people. The next full-scale invasion of the lands north of the Black Sea took place a century and a half later in December of 1240. This time, the invaders were Mongols. They were more forceful and more powerful than any who had come before them. The Mongol Empire enveloped all of modern Ukraine as well as what is now Russia. In Russia, their presence lasted until the end of the 15th century, subjecting the people there to 300 years of harsh, oppressive existence. The Mongol rulership of Ukraine was less oppressive and of shorter duration, coming to an end by the middle of the 14th century. Yet the destruction caused by the overthrow of Kyiv caused devastation that would take centuries to recover from. However, the Mongols allowed the people to maintain their Orthodox Christian faith and to live their lives much as beforehand. In some respects, Mongol rule even brought stability and trade to the region. In exchange for tribute, the Mongols gave the local leaders complete independence over internal affairs. In 1363, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Blue Waters, and Kyiv subsequently became part of that Grand Duchy. Another large swath of territory, known as Ruthenia, was taken by the Grand Duchy of Poland. The Mongol control of the Ukrainian lands came to an end in 1480 with the Great Standoff at the Ugar River. With the Ukrainian territory now divided between Lithuania and Poland, the region lost its semi-independent status. Political, social, and cultural influences were introduced, and the princely rule in Kyiv that reached back to the 10th century came to an end. In 1569, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was established, realigning the borders between them. Most of the Ukrainian territories were transferred to Poland. The Belarusian territories were to be part of Lithuania. This marked the separation of Ukraine and Belarus. In 1648, a Ukrainian general named Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a Cossack uprising against the King of Poland. Bogdan led his army into Kyiv and was welcomed as a liberator by the people. He then established the Cossack Hetmanate, a Ukrainian Cossack state which lasted until 1764. He made an alliance with the Russian Tsar, who acknowledged his loyalty to Russia. There followed a 30-year war between the Russians and the Grand Duchy of Poland. It ended with the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1686, under which the Cossack Hetmanate was divided between Poland and Russia. The Cossack Hetmanate was allowed to continue, but only on the Russian portion on the left bank of the Dnieper. However, it was to be a puppet Russian state. In fact, the Hetmanate was officially called Little Russia in Moscow. In 1708, the Cossacks, with the assistance of Sweden, attempted to rebel against the Russians and assert their independence. Their defeat at the Battle of Poltava crushed the vision of Ukraine as being separate from Russia. Following victory at the Battle of Poltava, the Russian Empire began to emerge as a European superpower. Its borders moved west and south, forcing the Ottomans to retreat from the northern Black Sea region. Following victory in the Russo-Turkish War between 1768 and 1774, Tsarina Catherine the Great encouraged German immigration into Ukraine. Large numbers of Ukrainians, Russians, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Greeks moved into the Black Sea steppe between the Black and Caspian Seas. Toward the end of the 18th century, Poland was subjected to 3 partitions that ended its existence as a sovereign state. Its lands were divided between the Habsburg monarchy, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire. Then, in 1830, a Polish rebellion against Russian rule took place. Large populations in Belarus, Lithuania, and the right bank of Ukraine joined the uprising. The Imperial Russian army moved in and crushed the rebellion. Poland was then fully swallowed up by Russia. In the first decades of the 19th century, a growing nationalism movement spread throughout Ukraine. It was fueled by Enlightenment ideas and led by an intelligentsia class. By 1900, a number of nationalist parties had emerged throughout the land. In 1862, the Ukrainian national anthem was written. Its opening line declares, "Ukraine has not yet perished." At the same time, many Ukrainians migrated further east into the Russian Empire. This accelerated after the opening of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1906. In the decade between 1906 and 1916, 1.6 million Ukrainians moved into Russia. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw rapid industrialization in Ukraine. In 1870, a Welshman named John Hughes had arrived with 8 ships at the steppe on the Donets River in southern Ukraine, north of the Sea of Azov. His intention was to establish a full-cycle metallurgical plant. Within a few years, he had constructed an iron smelting and rail works. A town grew up around the works. It was then called Yuzivka, now Donetsk. This was to develop as the main hub of the Donbas-Donetsk industrial basin. Following the disaster of the Crimean War in the 1850s, Russia realized that to retain Crimea, it would have to build a rail connection through southern Ukraine to the peninsula and its naval base there. In 1857, Ukraine also accounted for 75% of all Russian exports, further underlining the need for a rail system. The main commodity was grain, with much of it coming from the region of Podolia. Odessa had become the main gateway to the markets of Europe. The rail line from Balta to Poltava and Kharkiv was completed in 1875. Over the next quarter century, further rail lines were built across Ukraine, promoting economic development, increasing mobility, and breaking down old cultural boundaries. Revolution came to Russia on Sunday, January 9, 1905, when around 20,000 workers and their families marched to the center of St. Petersburg. They were demanding basic workers' rights for the working class, which had arisen from the Industrial Revolution from Tsar Nicholas II. As they closed in on the Tsar's Winter Palace, the army opened fire. More than 100 protesters were killed, with another 500 being injured. 3 days later, the revolution had spread to Ukraine. On Wednesday, January 12th, workers in Kyiv went on strike. Others around the country soon joined in, both in the cities and the villages. Peasants began cutting down forests belonging to the nobility and even attacking the mansions of the nobles. As he had in St. Petersburg, the Tsar used the army to crush the rebellion, with dozens more being killed. In June, a mutiny took place on the battleship Potemkin, which was part of the Black Sea Fleet. Most of the sailors involved were Ukrainian. They killed their commanding officers and then headed from the open sea to Odessa to support the workers' strike there. They eventually ended up in Romania, where they surrendered to the authorities. The workers' strikes reached a crescendo in October 1905. The entire empire was brought to a halt by a railway strike centered in the Ukraine. More than 120,000 workers across Ukraine went on strike, with more than 2 million doing so across the empire. Tsar Nicholas had no choice but to offer a concession in the form of a manifesto granting basic civil rights, including universal male suffrage. In the wake of strikes, there was a major backlash against the Jews of the empire, who were blamed for the revolutionary foment. Pogroms were carried out across Ukraine. Thousands were injured, and tens of thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed. The real fomenters of the revolution were the Bolsheviks, a radical wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, denounced the Tsar's manifesto and called for a nationwide revolt. The first Ukrainian political party, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party, was formed in 1900. Activists within the party established networks across Ukraine, encouraging the peasantry to join them in rebellion. They had their stated goal of independence from Russia. It would take a world war, however, for that goal to become a reality. World War I was the catalyst that led to the downfall of Imperial Russia. When war broke out in 1914, there was a surge of patriotic enthusiasm across Russia, with jingoistic flag-waving. Russia allied with France and England against Germany and Austria-Hungary. In the European socialist movement, large numbers of former internationalists became patriots overnight when war was declared. The Russian people were less inclined than others to outright patriotism. Most of them assumed a defensist position of supporting Russia's war effort as long as it was in defense of Russian territory. The initial enthusiasm for the war quickly soured. The Russian army suffered crushing defeats and losses. The German army penetrated deep into the western territories of the empire, causing a chaotic outflow of refugees into central Russia. Defeat bred suspicion. It was not long before the Russian soldiers began to wonder if those in the trenches opposite were their only enemies. The Tsarist government, through its prodigious incompetence, seemed to pose almost as great a threat as the Germans. Every item of equipment was in short supply. Many men were sent to the front without boots, proper clothing, and sometimes even without rifles. So severe was the shortage of artillery ammunition that some units were rationed to 5 shells per day. Lacking sufficient firepower, the Russian officers sent their troops against the Germans in wave after wave, hoping to overwhelm them by sheer weight of numbers. Such tactics did succeed in posing one problem for the enemy. The German commander, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, later wrote that his men had found it difficult to use their machine guns when the field of fire was blocked by mounds of Russian corpses. In 1917, the Russian Empire was in crisis. Food shortages in Petrograd provoked worker strikes and mutinies in the armed forces. The Tsar was convinced to abdicate the throne. He passed it to his brother, but he refused to take it. The monarchy came to an ignominious end, and a provisional government was created. The February Revolution caught the Ukrainian nationalists completely by surprise. They quickly moved in, and in March, the Central Rada or Council was created. They demanded territorial autonomy for Ukraine under a reformed Russian state. They claimed jurisdiction over much of modern Ukraine and, in July, were recognized by the regional government in Petrograd as the regional government of Ukraine. Finally, autonomy had arrived.